Hi there. Today's book, Eject, Eject, is an absolutely fascinating study of the history, the development and the processes by which the system of ejection from an aircraft was developed to replace the existing methods during World War II, where the pilot had to climb out of the aircraft and go into free fall, then deploy his parachute. As aircraft became faster towards the end of World War II and jet aircraft and even rocket aircraft were introduced, the difficulty of escape from the aircraft became apparent. And there were some experiments in Germany and Sweden, but it was really in the UK with the Martin Baker Company that the idea came to fruition. And the book is written by John Nichol, who is uniquely qualified to write the book, having had to eject from a tornado during the First Gulf War. John Nichol has written, as I said, a fascinating book, and parallel to the material on the development of the ejection seat from its simplest concept onwards to the very, very highly complex systems they have today. There are also actual cases of aircrew using the ejection seat in various wartime situations, in the Vietnam War, the First Gulf War and so on, and also in peacetime training. Now, when Martin Baker, and it was mainly James Martin who was the surviving partner, really was pushing this idea, they first built a test rig in their factory, which was a seat mounted on vertical rails that would be fired up these rails to the height that it would clear the tailplane of the aircraft. And this was done using an explosive charge. So at first they used sandbags and things like that, but they needed human test subjects to find out if the stresses on the human physiology could be tolerated. And it was a chap called Benny Lynch, who was just one of the guys who worked in the factory, who volunteered for this, and there's pictures of him in the book strapped into the test rig wearing his suit and tie. And as you might imagine, blasting a seat with a human cargo weighing plus equipment weighing 200-pound pilot plus the seat at a speed enough to get it clear of the aircraft required quite a charge, and it was found that it could be quite damaging, particularly to the spine. So eventually a double charge system was introduced, which had an initial charge which got everything moving, and then a second charge kicked in to accelerate. So the acceleration wasn't from 0 to maximum straight away. It was a two-stage acceleration, which was much easier on the human anatomy. Now, back then, the system was that the pilot or other aircrew had to first manually jettison the canopy. He would then pull down a blind across his face, which would initiate the ejection. This blind then protected him from the speed of the excuse me, airflow outside the aircraft, because back then, and this is the 50s, pilots were not wearing the full face visors. Once the ejection seat was clear of the aircraft, he then had to get rid of the seat. He was wearing two harnesses, an inner harness which connected into his parachute, and an outer harness which connected into the seat. And quite often, as you can imagine, in the throes of an ejection, which is always an emergency situation, and it can be very unpredictable, and the pilot can have debris in his eyes and so on, they couldn't often see which harness to undo, and there was always some consternation about whether they were actually getting rid of the parachute. But assuming it all went well, you've opened the outer harness, and you then have to kick free from the seat, and you are then in free fall. Now, free fall parachuting is quite a skilled occupation in itself, and to do it for the first time under these conditions must be quite terrifying. So you're in free fall, you go for the D-ring, and the canopy deploys, and you float to the ground. So that was the system, and it was very little, there was very little automation in it, and a lot had to be done by the pilot. Gradually over the years, Martin Baker and other companies such as the American ACES company developed ways to make this much more automatic. For example, by activating the ejection seat, which later on was from a ring between your legs, and you pulled it vertically, the first thing that would happen is that the canopy would be automatically ejected. And in some cases there were lines of plastic explosive built into the canopy in case it failed to eject. It could be blown open, and then a millisecond later the seat would fire, and you would be blown from the aircraft. There were other innovations such as ways of automatically bringing the limbs in, the arms and legs, so that when you went out into a 500-mile-an-hour airstream, your arms wouldn't be torn off. So there were inflation tubes or lanyards which would pull the limbs inwards and have you within the silhouette of the seat. The seat would automatically fall away, the barometric triggers for that, and the canopy would deploy again, sometimes barometrically. So if you had to eject at very high altitude, you would be in free fall for a while, so you weren't under canopy and freezing to death at very, very high altitude. So over the years, things did improve, and there were different types of seat developed. Now, there's quite a bit of humour in the book amongst all the heroism, but one of the funny stories is at a very early air show in the 50s, they were going to demonstrate a live ejection from a Meteor jet. The rear crew member was going to eject in front of the spectators, but unfortunately the test subject had been injured previously, and so they announced they had to cancel this. But there was a chap from the crowd who actually volunteered to do it, and his name was Mr. Keys, and he said he'd always wanted a parachute and this was his chance. And amazingly, the company said okay, and they briefed him and it was still the completely manual system. He had to get rid of the seat himself, and they said as soon as you got rid of the seat, go for the D-ring and deploy the parachute. And he said, well, I've always wanted a parachute. Can't I delay it to enjoy the ride a bit more? Oh, no, you've got to pull the D-ring straight away because you'd be at fairly low level. So they strapped him in and up he went, and ejected. He got rid of the seat, but in the airflow took his spectacles off, and he was very, very short-sighted, and he couldn't see the ground, and he ended up pulling the D-ring very, very late, ploughed in quite heavily and got injured. And Martin Baker Company got a slap on the wrist from the Air Ministry because they had an unauthorised civilian flying in a military jet and ejecting. Now, during the Vietnam War, there were many cases of ejections, and one story in the book is a chap, Charlie Gruter, who ejected, but he managed to make it to the coast and landed in the water and was picked up by a rescue helicopter. But then, not long after, he had to eject again, and this time it was over land, and he was captured. And like many of the pilots, or most of them who were captured, he was subject to terrible torture and long periods of imprisonment for the duration of that conflict. And the Allied personnel who were captured by the communists were very, very badly treated. No Geneva Convention involved there. And it's a very harrowing story. And what it led to was the concept of having an ejection system that also allowed the aircrew to travel some distance, hopefully making it back to friendly lines or to the coast. And various suggestions were made, sort of built-in gliders and all sorts of things, and most of them looked like they'd been developed by Wile E. Coyote. And the sort of prize amongst them was a system that turned the ejection seat into a gyrocopter, and there's a picture of it. There were other systems. The B-58 Hustler bomber had a pod system for the crew to eject, and the F-111, the entire cockpit ejected as a sealed unit, and it was fairly economical in as much as that whole cockpit unit could be recovered and used in another airframe. These were ways to mitigate the effects of very, very high speed, high altitude ejection, which was a problem. Another aspect was escape by the members of a bomber aircrew. The Americans, initially with the B-47 and then with the B-52, worked on ways, because the crew were in separate areas of the jet, and the pilots in the conventional method would eject upwards, but some of the crew positions were on a lower level, so the idea was to eject downwards. Obviously, if you're at low level, this is going to be a bit of a problem, but if you were at normal altitude, where you possibly hit with anti-aircraft or SAM missiles, the crew could escape that way. And it was suggested that this system be fitted into RV bombers, our famous Vulcan, Valiant and Victor, and there was a system devised by Martin Baker for the Vulcan, but the RAF, or the Air Ministry, decided not to adopt it, and it was always a two-stage system where the pilots had ejection seats and the rest of the crew had to climb out just as they would have had to have done from a Lancaster bomber during World War II. Another interesting story in the book took place in the 80s during the Cold War over West Germany, and there was a British, an RAF Jaguar two-seater flying, doing a routine flight, and there was an RAF Phantom in the vicinity that was tasked to practice interceptions, and it decided to do an interception and a trainee missile launch on the Jaguar. The idea was to simulate a missile launch. However, they were flying with a fully armed aircraft with live weapons. The pilots of the Phantom and the observer, to their credit, tried to make it as safe as possible. There was supposed to be an X of red tape over the arming switch. In the aircraft that they used, this tape wasn't in place, and they actually requested some more tape. And unusually for British officialdom, there was a lack of red tape, and so they just had to remember not to touch the arming switch. And the observer actually pulled out the fuse panel which made the weapon live. Unfortunately, during manoeuvring, he must have nudged it and it went back in and made a connection. And when they did the simulated attack on the Jaguar, they fired a live missile at fairly close range right up the jet pipe, and forcing the Jaguar aircrew to eject, and they ejected safely. In the vicinity was a West German Air Force Luftwaffe F-104, and he saw this. And when he landed at his base, he said to his compadres, the Brits have gone mad. He just watched one British jet shoot down another. Anyway, the pilot of the Jaguar, Dave Griggs, had another ejection, another emergency, another ejection 16 weeks later over Scotland. Now, when you eject, Martin Baker gives you a certificate with the number on it and also a tie. And in the 16 weeks between the two ejections, Dave Griggs got two certificates, and they were 50 numbers apart. There'd been 50 ejections in the 16-week period. And it makes you wonder what is happening to our aircraft in a peacetime Air Force. It's food for thought. In my opinion, that firing of a live missile has implications for firearms safety. The rules of firearms safety about live weapons, and you know, you would never in training or in a scenario training or simulation, you'd never point a weapon armed with lethal live ammunition. That's why simu-missions was developed. So it just reinforces that thing that there's never a safe way of messing around with live weapons. Now, the book does cover some of the mishaps with ejection seats, and just like in the wider world of aviation, they are usually the result of a chain of events somebody's forgotten to tighten a screw, or has over tightened a screw, or has forgot to replace a part, forgot to arm something, and small mistake from human error, and we're all human and we forget things, and especially if you've done a task 1,000 times, and most of the problems have come from that. However, even the best laid plans can go wrong, and we must remember that ejections are always emergency situations, and the pilot in the ejection seat may be ejecting into a debris cloud, which can affect what happens. He can be unstable, unusual attitudes. One of the things that Martin Baker worked on was what was called 0-0 ejection, where they could eject on the runway with the aircraft with very little forward speed at 0 altitude, and still get the pilot high enough to have the canopy working. And that was an aim of theirs which they succeeded in doing. The book doesn't mention it, but I remember as a lad reading an account, and I checked on it for this review, of a Blackburn Wyvern aircraft going into the sea off a carrier, and the pilots actually ejected underwater and escaped the aircraft. So there were some really amazing things happened. As I mentioned, the more modern seats have a lot of automation built in, and the pilot or the aircrew have to do very, very little to take necessary action themselves. It's all done automatically. In fact, some of the seats actually decide when it's an emergency situation and go themselves. There's also, they developed quite a while back, a system where if either of the aircrew ejected, the other seat would go as well. It was a command eject, and the pilots could choose whether that setting was activated or not. And there were cases where it was necessary. And there's a case in the book, and I won't go into the details because it's a fantastic story of a flight in a Harrier, and the pilot was hit with a bird strike and had no other alternative but to eject, and hoped that it was a female who was just having a familiarization ride in the back would realise to eject as well. I'll put the picture of them together, because at the book launch party for this book, they and many of the other people were there, and Jeremy Vine spoke about it on his TV show, and it was quite moving. So I'll put the photo of that. So all in all, Eject is a superb book, full of interesting facts, interesting stories, interesting characters, and a combination of tremendous ingenuity on the part of Martin Baker and the allied ejection seat manufacturers and of the aircrew, who in many cases the ejection was only the start of their ordeal. I can't recommend this book highly enough.